The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
We've all seen the horrible images of devastation and brutality in Ukraine. Tonight, we'll hear from a former head of the International Criminal Court on whether Russia should be charged with war crimes. Then, our Ontario hubs bring advice from medical officers of health in the province on staying safe during the sixth wave of COVID-19. And from a contender for leadership of the federal Conservatives to the return of Phonics for elementary students, we've got the agendas we can review. It's Friday, April 22nd, and that's all ahead on the agenda. Since the early days of this war, missile strikes hit civilian targets across Ukraine to the outrage of the world. But the carnage discovered earlier this month in the northwest town of Bucha led to calls for Russia to be tried for war crimes by no less than the President of the United States and our own Prime Minister. Chile Ebo Osuji was president of the International Criminal Court. He is currently distinguished international jurist at Ryerson University's Lincoln Alexander School of Law. And Chile Ebo Osuji joins us now from Ontario's capital city. It's very nice, sir, to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Right off the top, how would you define a war crime?
A war crime is basically crimes that are committed in the context of an armed conflict. That's a rough and ready definition of it. But there are some signal conducts that hallmarks of that. For instance, killing people in cold blood who are not involved in the armed conflict, like targeting civilian population and killing them, and wanton destruction of civilian property that are not military objective, even when you could say that the certain location would be, military objective because there may be soldiers shooting from there. That's still not a license to bring down hell and brimstone on the place. There's a requirement for proportionality of response to that kind of fire coming from you. Destroying cultural property. So these are all some of the signal conducts that you would describe as war crimes. Declaring that no prisoner of war will be taken, killing prisoners of war from on either side. So again, these are some of the conducts. There are about 40 to 50 distinct different conducts that would amount to war crimes. But effectively, generally speaking, these are crimes committed in the context of an armed conflict.
What allegations of war crimes have there been in Ukraine?
Well, we've seen on TV all the apartment blocks that have been damaged, some destroyed rather. Cities look like sections of cities razed to the ground where civilians lived, and those are obvious, and there are those are conducts that need to be aberrations that need to be investigated. There are allegations of targeting civilians and killing them. There are allegations of discoveries of mass graves. Those, again, need to be investigated. The circumstances of those mass graves, would they be people who died as people do die in wars, and it was convenient to bury people in a mass grave? Or was the mass grave in question, did it have a more sinister circumstances to it? So those are some of the allegations we have heard.
I guess for war is gruesome, but there are rules of engagement during a war. Can you expand on that for us? Because I think when people hear war crimes, war is already gruesome to begin with.
Indeed, but the idea, or what international law seeks to do, is to recognize the starting point is that the gruesomeness of war. But we cannot just leave it at that. Yes, war is gruesome, so people should go ahead and indulge yourselves. No, the idea is how could, in spite of the gruesomeness of war, how can we still maintain, a modicum of civilized behavior, even so? And that is the restraining impulse or the restraining pressure that law brings to the fighting of war. So fight it if you're attacked in self-defense, but even as you defend yourself against a war of aggression, as we've seen now, Russia has done in Ukraine. You're not, as someone fighting a war of self-defense, it's not a free-for-all, do whatever you want. And if harmless soldiers are captured, wounded soldiers are captured, or soldiers who are sick, for instance, who are no longer fighting, people we say that who are outside the fight or out of the fight, yes, it's okay to kill them. No, that is forbidden by international law. Those are some of the obvious ways how law tries to restrain war. The most obvious one, of course, is that civilians who did not bring this thing upon themselves, who made no decision for the war to begin in the first place, they must be left alone. So the law requires that those basic impulses of humanity must be observed at all times, even though war is being fought.
We've been seeing the gruesome images of Russia's invasion in Ukraine on the news, and I'm just going to give our viewers a warning that these pictures are very upsetting. Let's take a look at some pictures taken by photojournalist Lindsay Adario, who is in Ukraine with the New York Times. The first shows a mother and her two children killed by Russian forces as they tried to flee along a known civilian evacuation route from Irpin on March 6. In the second picture, we can see firefighters are standing in a moment of silence after unearthing a 42-year-old Ukrainian man who was buried under rubble when his home was hit by a Russian strike in March. Pictures captured by photojournalists point to what seems like deliberate targeting of civilians by Russian forces. Do you think the International Criminal Court will see it that way?
The International Criminal Court is now engaged in relation to the war crimes part of it, and to the extent that evidence brings out whether genocide was committed on either side. As you know, that allegation was made by Russians to begin with, and now Ukrainians are making that. So the International Criminal Court would also investigate that part of it, whether crimes against humanity have been committed. Again, the International Criminal Court will investigate that. What the International Criminal Court cannot do is engage the crime of aggression part of things, which is a distinct crime, and we can talk about that if you want. But whether or not the International Criminal Court would see that those gut-wrenching images you've shown, whether they will see that as a war crime, requires investigation. Because as you started out saying that in wars, it's awful, people die, and often innocent people die, not necessarily because of sinister targeting, but the people do die in war. The International Criminal Court would do that investigation to find out whether these are what they call collateral damages in war, or these what happened there was a result of deliberate targeting of civilian populations in those ways that international law forbid.
So you're saying that they would have to prove intent to commit the war crime?
Yes, it will have to prove intent. They also have to prove that what happened when... it need not be intent as well. Of course, the obvious one would be when the crime was intentional, but you may not intend to necessarily kill someone, but if you're targeting a civilian population deliberately, and because you believe that's one way to intimidate the other side into giving up. Well, when people die in that, we cannot come and say, sorry, I did not intend to kill anyone. I only intended to target the civilian location. Well, that will not be good enough. So it's not just the intent, but also there are certain rules of conduct that must be respected, things that must not happen. And once the evidence shows that those things that should not happen did happen, then one would have a case of war crimes to answer.
Well, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau weighed in on the growing calls to label Russia's actions in Ukraine a genocide at a news conference on April 13th. Let's watch the clip.
I think, as President Biden highlighted, there are official processes around determinations of genocide, but I think it's absolutely right that more and more people be talking and using the word genocide in terms of what Russia is doing, what Vladimir Putin has done.
Do we have evidence of genocide in Ukraine?
Again, it's important, as the Prime Minister, signaled that he premised his remark by saying that a legal process is to be followed. And I do also believe that President Biden said the same thing. He said, well, lawyers will tell us. But from the perspective of politics, they were calling it as they see it. So that it's important to keep that in mind. Now, there are specific definitions of genocide that investigations will require. Specific definitions, for instance, the genocide, it rests heavily on the requirement of intent, the intent to destroy a racial group, ethnic group, religious group, or national group in whole or in part. So that is the intent, genocidal intent. So once that intent is established because the evidence directly establishes it, or the circumstances of the case would point to that, then once that intent is there, then there are 5 acts, we call them in law, acts of genocide, that once those are committed will then 2 and 2 together, or 1 + 1 in terms of the equation, amounts to genocide. And those 5 acts would be, the obvious one would be killing members of that group we're talking about here, racial group, ethnic group, religious group, or national group, killing those with intent to destroy them in whole or in part, or inflicting serious bodily or mental harm to the group. That's a second. The third one would be imposing upon the group conditions of life calculated to destroy that group in whole or in part. And then the fourth one would be taking measures to prevent birth to that group. And the fifth one would be transferring children of the group to another group. So those are the 5 acts of genocide. So once any of those is identified to have occurred, coupled with intent to destroy that group in whole or in part, then we have ourselves a case of genocide there.
Well, who has the power to prosecute Russia for these alleged crimes?
Again, there are 4 international crimes. Now, we'll talk about crime of aggression. Let's separate that. But the other 3 would be genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. At the current moment, the ICC would have jurisdiction to prosecute those. Now, remember here, the ICC's jurisdiction is only complementary. It's only, in a sense, secondary. The primary jurisdiction remains that of Ukraine, or even Russia, to prosecute its own troops who've done that. But here we're talking about Ukraine. Ukraine has the primary jurisdiction to do that prosecution, but where Ukraine is unable or unwilling to do so, or in fact invites the ICC to do so, as Ukraine has done now, then the ICC can prosecute those 3 crimes, as I indicated. Now, the one crime the ICC cannot prosecute now would be the crime of aggression, which is what started it all when the president of Russia declared that he was sending his troops there to conduct a special operation. Now, he can call it a special operation, but international law calls it a war of aggression, and that is a crime in international law. Unfortunately, the ICC cannot investigate and prosecute the crime of aggression. It can prosecute the other three. And the reason why it cannot prosecute the crime of aggression was because the big powers, the 5 countries that have veto power at the UN Security Council, including, by the way, United States, leading actually this pressure the ICC, or those who negotiated the Rome Statute of the ICC, into defining the crime of aggression in a way that the ICC cannot prosecute that crime or cannot prosecute a national of a state that is not a member state of the Rome Statute, and Russia is not. The only way that the ICC can do that is when the Security Council refers the case of aggression to the ICC. But the Security Council cannot do that now because Russia would exercise veto power over that. So that's how aggression is off limits for the ICC, whereas the other 3 crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crime, the ICC can prosecute those. And I understand that the ICC prosecutor is already investigating for purposes of doing just precisely that.
Well, the ICC can't try people in absentia. Should they be able to?
You're right. That's a matter of what the law. Sorry. Let me rephrase that. You're right as a matter of how the understanding at the ICC has been. But those of you who might have followed my work, especially the lawyers who followed my opinion at the ICC, I did say that the Rome Statute does not require that. Does not require that, or does not forbid the ICC from prosecuting in absentia. That is not precisely what international human rights law requires. What's required to be done is justice, and when an accused person chooses to try to frustrate justice by staying away from justice deliberately, then the court can, and the ICC should be able to prosecute that person in absentia, as long as they've been given notice that, look, that notice can be given in a number of ways, any number of ways, by advertising it and announcing it for the whole world that this case is going on. Please, Mr. X, come and defend yourself, bring your lawyers. If that is done reasonably well and the person still chooses to absent themselves from the proceedings, yes, the court should be able to proceed with the trial. And if in future that person chooses to come back and prove, is able to prove that, well, I did not get this notice, then we discuss whether or not the trial needs to be done again. But until then, the case should be able to go on. And by the way, this is nothing radical, a proposition. The European Court of Human Rights has precisely said that cases can be done in that way. So has the United Nations Human Rights Committee. They have agreed that cases can be tried in absentia if sufficient notice is given to the accused person. And by the way, in Canada, that is also the law, as well as in the UK. So it is, in my view, an amendment that needs to be done, or adjustment in thinking that needs to be done in international law.
I'm going to ask you a question, and I really hope that it doesn't sound disrespectful, because I'm not trying to be disrespectful. And I think it's a question that you probably heard many times. There's this perception that primarily African and South American leaders are brought in front of the ICC. Does the court really have the power to prosecute someone as powerful in the Western world like Vladimir Putin?
It's not a disrespectful question at all. It's a proper question. Yes, many people, do from time to time engage that question in the context of the ICC and saying, ICC goes for what they call low-hanging fruit, being mostly the African leaders and all that. I have not been impressed by that. I've always said that argument comes mostly from the perspective of basically, let's put it this way. That argument does not help victims of any crime we're talking about here. The African victims of the genocide in Rwanda, for instance, will not come and say, hang on, why are you prosecuting those who committed this genocide against us, and now we're African victims of apartheid South Africa, for instance, had we had the ICC at the time, would not be complaining that African leaders were being prosecuted for apartheid because those, apartheid authors were, in my view, African leaders. So it is not, in my view, an impressive argument at all. The argument should, of course, mean, and it should be stressed, that the dividends of international justice should have that effect all over the world, because justice, denial of justice anywhere is denial, a threat to it everywhere, said Martin Luther King. So that is an argument that can sensibly be made to say, support the ICC so that it can do more. So I'm all for that. But not to say, well, ICC should not be doing work because it is benefiting victims effectively. That's the argument. The work of the ICC is disproportionately benefiting African victims of atrocities. I don't buy that that's as a complaint at all. Now, can the ICC get at Mr. Putin? That's not a unique, assuming he's indicted. It is not a unique problem for the ICC, mind you, or should we say Mr. Putin. For a long time, there was an African leader, his name was Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, whom the ICC was seeking for a long time, and ICC did not get at him, and that still remains the case. There's a lot of even minor figures who've been indicted and who have not been surrendered to the ICC, arrested and surrendered, and those should have, states should have done that, arrest people who've been indicted and handed them up to the ICC. So it would not be correct to say if ICC does not get a particular figure, let's say hypothetically now, if it's Mr. Putin, the reason why ICC would not have got at him was because he is so powerful. There was a case I prosecuted, I presided over at the ICC of a very small person in Sudan that the court didn't get at because there was no will to arrest that person and surrender him to the ICC. So let's not look at it from that perspective. Perhaps the question is, all right, all these people that are beyond, who are being protected in their zones that the court or any court at all cannot reach, what about that? It's a good question, but I don't believe that that question is a reason to not want to push for justice. Right. We know that there have been instances where, for instance, in Serbia, the former president of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, was indicted by the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia when he was in office. And that arrest warrant was not executed. And for a long time, he was cooped up in Serbia. But eventually, there was a change of regime and he was surrendered to the ICTY. In West Africa, you had the Special Court for Sierra Leone as well, where President Charles Taylor of Liberia was indicted. Again, for the longest time, he was in power, but eventually he was surrendered to the court when he was in exile in Nigeria. We could go, Mr. Hissène Habré, former president of Chad. It took a while to try him in Senegal before a court established by the African Union. So the point I make here is that eventually justice has a way of catching up to those whom he wants to catch up with. So it's not to say, well, because it would be difficult to arrest the person immediately, so what's the point? There is a big point. On that, if I may, one more word and I leave that point alone. I tell people this. Now, the pandemic has shown us how people can run stir crazy being confined to their homes. We saw that. You and I, it's not easy. But for these big people, heads of state, their little cell can be their countries. So if you indicted them and they're not able to travel the world and attend conferences and red carpet events, having them confined to their countries is not good for them eventually. So it is something to worry about. You don't want to be leaving your country as a head of state and wondering who's going to arrest you and take you another place. That's at the least most undignifying, but it can be worse than that.
In our final minute here, what can be done to prevent war crimes like this from ever occurring?
One big gap that I keep stressing is that the idea of right to peace needs to be realized in international law as a treaty right. It's important to now negotiate and adopt what we can call a covenant on the right to peace. The idea is not to leave it at a level of declaration. Right to peace, that a good thing to have, but to make it a treaty right. And the value of making it a treaty right is that it becomes the right to peace becomes enforceable. It means that the victims of wars of aggression, all those people whose homes have been destroyed in Ukraine, who've been forced to flee or who have lost loved ones in that war of aggression, that is a crime in international law, would be able, on their own right, seek a remedy against the authors of the war of aggression or accomplices of the wars of aggression. It could be corporate accomplices or other states who are complicit in wars of aggression by knowing that there's a war of aggression going on and they are giving logistical support to it. So those are accomplices in wars of aggression. So at the end of the day, the victims of the war of aggression should be able to pursue their own remedies against the authors and accomplices of the war of aggression because those people violated their right to peace. So that wherever those authors of aggression, accomplices, have their assets and property, victims can go after those assets and property and attach them to make amends for what happened to them. If you have that filled up together with a realistic, a robust prosecutorial effort for wars of aggression, it will make it more difficult in future for people to boldly embark upon wars of aggression. I really, really believe that.
Thank you, sir. We really do appreciate you spending time with us. You've given us a lot to think about. We really do appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
In most settings, mask mandates have ended, and from school to shopping centers to places of worship, it's mostly up to the individual to decide how to protect themselves from the current highly infectious variant of COVID-19. Justin Chandler covers the Hamilton-Niagara region for our Ontario hubs, and he's been talking to medical officers of health in the province about helping people make good choices. Hey, Justin.
Hey there.
All right, so mask requirements were removed in most settings on March 21st in the province. What are some of the repercussions of the March 21st lift of the ban?
Well, one thing that all of the medical officers of health that I spoke to agree with is that once masking became optional rather than a requirement, a lot more people stopped wearing masks. Before, pretty much everybody was wearing them in all the settings. They were required to. Sure, maybe some people didn't, but that was the rule. And once that rule went away, what the doctors that I spoke to said was that it maybe gave people sort of a signal that things were more okay now. If it's not necessary, maybe you don't have to do it. And it also gave permission for the people who never wanted to wear masks to begin with to take them off. So consequently, it's not a requirement. We have far fewer people wearing masks, and I think most people anecdotally would back that up just to what they're seeing in their daily lives.
I think what's interesting is in the first month of sort of the ban being lifted, it was regular conversations to be, I walked into a store and I saw it's 50-50. Oh, there was a few people with their masks on, there's a few people without. I want to talk a little bit about a few of the regions that you spoke to and the people there. You talked to a few medical officers. Let's talk about Dr. Nicola Mercer in Guelph. What did you learn from that conversation when it came to sort of further restrictions and conversations about the mask ban?
Well, I would say of the doctors that I spoke to, Dr. Mercer was probably the most in line with what the province is doing here. What she had to say essentially is, yes, we're seeing an increased rise in cases. She said we saw probably a surge that would have happened anyway, just given the time of year and the course of the pandemic, and that coincided with masks coming off. So she said masks do make a difference at a population level. She hasn't linked taking off masks to increase transmission, as some people have, but she has said that what we're seeing here was not unexpected. I think the science table and the province both said the same thing, that we were going to see more cases as restrictions eased. But Dr. Mercer seems to think that for the most part, this is manageable. She says that we've got lots of protections in the community and in her area in Guelph, Wellington, Dufferin, Guelph, that things are going relatively okay.
So fair to assume in that region there aren't any ideas beyond reintroducing masks in Guelph?
No, that's correct. I asked her and she said she's definitely not prepping a Section 22 order. She said she would only do something like that to bring back masking if something had significantly changed, and in her mind, that has not happened.
All right, let's move over to Peterborough. You spoke to Peterborough's medical officer, Dr. Thomas Pigott. What is his plan to help in his jurisdiction to keep people safe as possible?
So Dr. Pigott is someone who has sort of a different view. He believes that getting rid of masking was the wrong decision, and that if we kept masks on, that would be much better. Now, in his region, it's actually at their highest alert. Public health has a scale there, and they say sort of how high risk is right now. And they had theirs at the highest when I spoke to him. They've got about, at the time, 50% more hospitalizations than they had at the peak of the fifth surge of cases. So things were not doing so hot there, I think would be fair to say. And so he was saying that really he thinks people should continue to wear masks, and he's actually looking at maybe making that mandatory. So we discussed sort of how that would look. He said perhaps he could issue a Section 22 order. That's Section 22 is one of the items under the Health Protection and Promotion Act, which is the legislation that gives medical officers of health their power, and it allows medical officers of health to order people to do certain things based on particular conditions. So essentially, they could use that to make masking mandatory, as some did at the start of the pandemic, actually including Dr. Mercer, interestingly. So all this to say, Dr. Pigott has considered doing that. He says that there are some potential drawbacks, and he's not really sure at this point, but he's still advocating for people to continue to wear masks while he thinks about whether or not he's going to make that decision.
You had mentioned the high hospitalization rates in the area of Peterborough. What is Dr. Pigott saying about, long COVID, and not just, getting away from catching COVID, but sort of the long-term effects of that as well?
Yeah, he's been careful to warn that it's not just hospitalizations that we want to prevent, but actually just getting COVID is no picnic, and it's something that we should try to avoid. Long COVID is something that's still not terribly well understood in the scientific community, but we do know that there's a sizable portion of people who actually get COVID-19 symptoms, and that can cause issues that last longer than the illness. So people might find, for example, loss of taste or brain fog, or these things that can go on much longer. And he said that this could even go to things that would affect the respiratory system, the circulatory system. So really, we're not just trying to prevent people from getting into hospital, but he says we want to prevent people from getting sick at all, because you never know if long COVID is going to stick around for somebody.
All right, let's move over closer to home for you in Niagara. Niagara's acting medical officer of health, Dr. Mustafa Herji. You've talked about him a few times on the show as sort of, the medical officer of your region. What has he had to say about sort of the masking mandates as well?
Yes, Dr. Herji was very candid in our discussion. He says that having masks be mandatory is, his words were, a no-brainer. He thinks that absolutely they should not have ended as a requirement, and that doing so right now was the wrong call. In Niagara, the transmission has reached highs greater than previous surges, not the last one, so not greater than the fifth, but still things are quite high there. The hospital system has paused resuming certain services because they're worried about staffing issues. So he says that what he's trying to do right now is encourage people to wear masks, talk to organizations about how they might go about requiring masks if that's something that they want to, and he's pressuring the province to bring that back, while he also considers bringing in orders himself to make that happen.
Overall, were there any other issues that Dr. Hirji brought up as well?
Well, as far as going about bringing masking back, if that's what he wants to do, he said he still wants to wait and see, to think about things and to see whether or not we're plateauing or whether transmission is going down in the area. But he did say that he's got some concerns about how the province might handle it if medical officers of health decided to go and put in local rules. So this is something that medical officers of health have discussed with each other, he says. It's also something that they've talked about how they might want to advocate to the province. But he's really worried that Ontario is essentially in a place politically where anyone who went against the grain might face some sort of pushback. And for this, he cited, say, a case in January where he tried to put in stronger measures in schools than what the province recommended, and he was effectively reprimanded by the chief medical officer of health. So he's worried that there might be some acrimony if someone like him tries to put in stronger measures. So he's particularly concerned, I think, about the direction that the province is taking Ontario here, and just what might be politically, not legally, but what might be politically acceptable, I guess would be the thing to say, as far as, just what the government's going to tolerate.
Justin, did Dr. Hirji or any of the other medical officers raise any concerns about the fact that potentially masks may be lifted in congregate settings like public transit and in long-term care homes in the weeks or months to come?
Yeah, we didn't get quite that far, but I think one of the things that they all agreed is that people should continue to wear masks in these high-risk settings. None of them said that people shouldn't. Dr. Mercer even said people need to think about what settings are high risk. So, for example, she said a lot of people don't wear them when visiting with friends and family. I think that would probably be pretty standard for most people, whereas she says that is still a very high risk situation. So I guess it's just up to people now to think about what they would consider high risk, not just for them, but for other people, because we know that masks don't just prevent you from getting sick, but it also can help you from spreading infection to others. So as things stand right now, where it is in all these regions, things are still optional. It's up now for individuals to decide and to do that risk calculation.
Justin, really appreciate the insights. Thank you so much. Coverage from mostly across Southern Ontario. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
The agenda this week put politics and therapy on the couch, assessed Sweden's pandemic track record, and heard arguments for bringing phonics back into Ontario's elementary reading curriculum. The agenda's Week in Review begins with Federal Conservative Party leadership hopeful Jean Charest.
The idea is that a carbon pricing cannot discriminate against rural Canadians. It cannot be a wealth transfer tax from one part of the country to the other. It has to be simple, it has to be flexible and smart in the way that it is implemented so that we transition while using oil and gas. You know, Europe put out their policy on transition where they very clearly say we are going to use nuclear and natural gas. Now, if they do it, so can we. And what we should do is a comprehensive policy that supports carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, green, blue, biofuels, and small modular reactors. That's the comprehensive approach we need to take.
Do you worry that you're offside from the majority of people in your home province of Quebec who tend to be anti-pipeline and who are not big supporters of oil and gas?
I've been criticized since the beginning of this race. I did an interview in French radio a few weeks ago where the interviewer, a very popular show, said he was disappointed that I was favorable to pipelines, disappointed that I am favorable to the oil and gas industry. But you know what? If we are going to get things done, we need a leader in the party who's able to stand up in Quebec and say, these are the things I believe in. The problem part of the problem, Steve, is that we haven't had someone in Quebec who's spoken to these issues, who's championed these issues and said, here's why we should do it. Now, the war in Ukraine has brought forward two very real issues. One is security of supply, which no one thinks about unless there's a crisis, but that's a job for governments. But that, all of a sudden, Canadians realize, well, here we have something we should attend to and make sure we have security of supply. The other issue is that we could have very well be an alternative to supplying oil and gas to Europe had we had our act together and done pipeline projects. And now the cruel situation we're in is that Europeans are indirectly funding Russia to attack Ukraine. And so all of a sudden, there's a different view on these issues that we need to speak to if we're going to make better choices.
If you were the Prime Minister today, how would Canadian policy vis-a-vis this war in Ukraine be different?
Well, I would be very, very committed to giving lethal weapons to Ukraine. I think we have to do as much as we can. As much as I dislike the idea of lethal weapons, because it's just the reality of war, that we need to support Ukrainians in fighting back against Russia. But we're not very well equipped to do that because we have not really had a strong defense policy in the last few years. It's been very weak. The other thing is support by any other way through financing. And the third thing is refugees, and being very, very much a helping hand for those Ukrainians who need to be supported as they find refuge and security. Some of them may choose to come here, and we have to be respectful of the fact they may choose to come here for a short period of time, a medium. We need to understand their particular circumstances. Some of them may choose to stay on forever, and that would be an extraordinary gain for the country. But those are three areas in which Canada needs to play a role.
Good therapy is about finding the balance between comfort and a good alliance and challenge. It's a strong therapeutic alliance that allows for the necessary challenges that I have to do with my clients in order for therapy to be effective. So that's kind of on one side of it. On another side of it, I'm again getting back to the specific example that I'm thinking of. I had a first session with a client who I won't give any details, but I will say that the client was displaying an article of clothing that had a particular symbol on it that has been associated with certain political views that I personally find reprehensible. But as a therapist, my job is not to immediately attack that person and criticize them and question, how dare you wear this symbol in my office? My job is to approach that person with curiosity about what that symbol means to them, what their understanding is of it, how they see themselves in the greater social context. And then hopefully we are able to build, again, a strong enough therapeutic alliance where I might be able to eventually question the client about how they think that symbol affects other people, and particularly me as a person of color sitting across the room from them. So I've had a lot of very interesting and nuanced discussions with people, depending on how similar or different our social and political views might be.
Okay, Leslie, that is too dramatic and delicious a story for me not to follow up on, so here goes. I'm just going to give a for instance here. I don't know if this was the case that you're referring to, but let's say somebody walks into your office with a skinhead and a Confederate flag or, on their T-shirt. How do you hold yourself back from wanting to go up to that person and smack him in the face?
Of course, let's just, under no circumstances, even outside of my therapy office, would I do anything like that. Regardless of the subject matter, it's really important for us as therapists to remain grounded and to be aware of what we are experiencing and what we are feeling in the room with clients. I think that's a huge part of doing good therapy, and also taking care of ourselves and protecting ourselves. And if anything was happening in the therapy session that was making me feel unsafe, I would find a way to extricate myself from that situation. But I would definitely be curious as to why that particular person came to meet with me. I used to work in an agency where clients were just assigned to me, and they didn't know me. They had probably never seen me before. They would just get, they would be given my name and an appointment time, and they would show up. And I am definitely aware that some people seemed taken aback to see probably a person of color. Maybe that's not what they were expecting. But in my private practice, people seek me out specifically. So if somebody sought me out in my private practice and then showed up dressed as you described, I would be very curious about why that person wanted to meet with me. And I would, again, I would ask what that symbolism means to that person. And I would also ask a lot of questions about that person's experience in the session with me. What is it like for you to sit in a room with me? How many people like me do you have contact with in your daily life? So it's just a lot of questions. And even as disagreeable as I may find the person's views, it is my job to approach that with compassion and empathy, because positive change in people does not take place when they are attacked and blamed and criticized. Positive change takes place when we are able to help people reflect on themselves and be introspective and to understand how their views affect their behavior and how their behavior affects their interaction with other people and how they fit into the world.
I just want to list some of the things that Sweden did in the early phase, uniquely so. Now, the first, we talked about herd immunity, but the problem we've had is that it's not only a laissez-faire strategy, it is a we will never admit a mistake strategy. That is fundamental. And Sweden very early on, and with good cause, said this does not spread pre-symptomatically. It does not, because they compared it to SARS-1, which did not. But most countries in the world abandoned that. Sweden did not. They maintained it does not spread pre-symptomatically. And what is the result of this? The result is that there was no masks used anywhere. I'm saying anywhere. It took a whole year before doctors and nurses in hospitals started wearing masks. People became infected by their, eye doctors. This is how crazy it was. Another example of how there's no pre-symptomatic spread affected the spread was that you were not allowed to stay at home if somebody in your household was sick with COVID. If you were a kid, you had to go to school. If you were an adult, you did not get whatever you call it when you get paid for being sick or staying home. So people were encouraged to go to work and school if someone in their household had COVID. And there was no testing outside of the hospitals and care homes, which means that Sweden had the lowest degree of testing in all of Europe for the first number of months. I just want to put this in context because these are crazinesses. This is outside of the realm of most countries. So in Sweden, it took a whole year before anybody started wearing a mask. Okay, I'll answer your question about Johan Anderberg. Johan Anderberg is one of the people who has written an excellent book where he really more or less proves that Sweden had a herd immunity strategy, but he ends up by saying that Sweden did the right thing because we had basically freedom, we maintained freedom. And that is very, very important. And so I will say, yes, I agree with him to the extent that you have to judge what's more important. Is death more important? Is freedom more important? Or all other aspects, if you keep kids home from school and they suffer, is that more important to not have that than deaths, So it's always a comparison. What is important in a society? And, Sweden have had 19,000 deaths in a population of 10.3 million.
All right. Well, let me follow up with Susie on that. I guess on the one hand, measuring the number of deaths is a very sort of simple empirical way to measure how devastating a problem has been. It's a little more complicated to measure the effects of, lockdowns, restrictions, and so on and so forth. Is that part of the difficulty in figuring out who's sort of right and who's wrong on this one?
Absolutely. Deaths are very tangible. You know what a death means and what it represents. When it comes to lockdowns, they're not all the same. Lockdowns represent a number of different interventions that are applied to varying degrees in different countries. And so I think there are some pieces of it that may be easier to study and understand better. For example, the impacts on children and lost learning and social development challenges and things like that. Impacts on mental health. I don't know if we'll ever be able to capture that to the degree that we need to, but certainly it's had an impact on mental health of populations in general. Economic losses, a little bit easier to measure perhaps, but maybe not on a micro level as much, more on a macro level. But there are probably a number of other experiential things that we just don't capture. And, you know, maybe decades from now, we'll start to get some of those anecdotes together, but they're equally important. I don't see this all as just about freedom. I think the experience is really important to capture. Does it end up balancing out in terms of death and morbidity and people having long COVID symptoms that they have to deal with the rest of their lives, et cetera? Well, I think that's a big challenge to try and weigh. You know, I'm more leaning at the side of, you know, the health of our population that we can measure and that we're seeing in front of us is, you know, an impetus to actually act. And when you see hospitalizations and long-term consequences and deaths, it's really hard to ignore that. But at the same time, we can't stop thinking about some of these other consequences.
We need to teach children their letters and the sounds that those letters represent, as well as then to be able to blend those individual sounds in words in order to decode them and read them, and to hear the individual sounds in words, a part of what we call phonemic awareness, which is really critical for spelling and writing words. And so we start teaching those letter sound correspondences, and we get kids reading right away, because practicing reading with their knowledge and spelling and writing with their knowledge is really important. So we teach a handful of letter sound correspondences. Kids start to decoding. We're adding to those quite quickly, the numbers that they're learning. And then they're practicing both with isolated words, and it's really important that practice also takes place in connected text, so in books. And in that way, we're enabling children to read the words on the page in books, and we're building that automatic quick word recognition, you know, right from novice beginners all the way to expertise. And so that's phonics and phonemic awareness, and that focus on practicing word reading skills is one critical and important component of a full literacy program.
And Katie, you know, maybe for some parents, if it's working the way it is, they might not feel like we need to change things. But do you think it would be better to serve students' needs if a phonics approach was implemented across classrooms?
Very much so, yes. Consistency is key too, right? So making sure that we're using the same language and the same strategies and using the same screening tools as we go, not just class to class or school to school, but also board to board across Ontario. Basically, that's it. I just feel that, you know, within my early literacy groups, I have small groups that I work with, these interventions that Jamie was talking about, I see them working in real time, and it's amazing. And so I'm hoping that this report maybe allows for those interventions to be provided to all students in all classrooms across Ontario.
It must be a thrill to watch a student comprehend and get it.
It is.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's seeing the confidence that I find,
Patricia, you wanted to say
most
something?
rewarding.
I'd say, as someone who's actually taught to read by phonics and coding, one of the significance is the complexity of the English language. We have 26 letters of the alphabet, but almost 50 different sounds. And the English language keeps importing words from other languages, but they maintain the sounds. And so it's very important to me, as someone, as I said, who learned that way, to create that and sustain that consistency by using phonics and coding.
Oh, I totally agree, because English is my fourth language, and I learned English primarily by reading. And every day in studio, it's like that's not said properly, because the way that I learned is very different. But Jamie, Ontario is home to students who don't speak English as a first language. How is teaching phonics a part of a culturally responsive approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to borrow, I was speaking last week with a principal and a school team who are really starting to implement this approach and seeing really good results. And how he explains it is that one of the most important concepts of culturally responsive pedagogy is that we teach in a way that all students can be successful, that we have high expectations for all students. And so from research, we know if we teach in this explicit and systematic way, giving the attention that's due to the code of our language, we can help so many students be successful, including students who have different cultural backgrounds or whose home language doesn't match with the school and the language of instruction. Now, at the same time, like any teaching that teachers are doing, we welcome and respect and bring in, the cultural diversity that's represented in the classroom. And for linguistically diverse classrooms, we can really make bridges. The more we know about the student's first language and what sounds it shares with the language of instruction.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's all for this Friday, April 22nd, 2022. Monday on the program, financier and author Bill Browder on his efforts to help freeze the assets of Russian oligarchs and survive Vladimir Putin's wrath. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve will see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.